Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon in cyberspace. And this is a real treat, this presentation. You know, it talks about the other side of the electricity industry, which is the markets. And one of the most dynamic markets is in California and many other Western states. And this market is called CAISO, C-A-I-S-O. And we have a very distinguished gentleman, and I'm really proud of this guy because he's a past graduate from our institute. So welcome, Chris, and he'll be conducting this remotely from California. We have an audience of sorts in cyberspace, and we've got you guys. And we're talking about such an interesting topic because the marketplace for electricity is really very complicated, and it's becoming even more complicated as renewables come in because they introduce a level of intermittency as well as, they're not reliable, like large generators. And so they need to think about two things. One is, how do you provide the energy? How do you provide the load? It's got to be done every instant of time. And also look ahead, the day-ahead market. And Chris is involved in this for his utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is one of the largest utilities in the United States. And I'll just kind of go over what he's a vice president for NU Energy. He's a vice president of finance, and he's a senior day-ahead analyst and day-ahead operations and hydro optimization. And so he's got a lot of responsibilities, and PG&E, by the way, does have a lot of hydro facilities as well as a pump storage hydro facilities, which is like a battery. And so really welcome, Chris. Welcome as a past student from Lehigh University, and so you got the floor.
Thank you very much. So, as was mentioned, I work out at Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a company of about 23,000 employees. So it pretty much takes care of the entire northern part of California. And I'll go into a little bit more about kind of what I do and what space we're in just a second here. So I'll show a quick agenda. So introduction was already done. I'll go over who I am, what I do, and which is kind of complicated to explain, so I'll try and keep it understandable for everybody, because I always get that question. I never know how to answer it. Then I'll go over the ISO overview, and then the two different markets that we participate in, the day-ahead market and the real-time market. Quick overview of the future of where things are going, and then Q&A at the end. So, what I am and what I do. So I'm a senior day-ahead analyst for a team known as the short-term electric supply. And it's short-term because we're looking at the next day and then as well as the real-time intraday. So it's fairly short-term. I have a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from San Diego State, and then master of engineering in energy systems from Lehigh, as mentioned. My capstone project that I did while at Lehigh was to design a micro hydro facility for PP&L at one of their acid mine drainage sites, which kind of got me interested in the whole hydro space. And what I do is I'm one of two primary hydroelectric power schedulers. And basically what we do is we optimize our hydro portfolio. So we have a set of storage that we can either pull from or hold, and we optimize whether we should use that now, use it later, whether we should sell it off, pretty much using water as our commodity. What do we do with that? And there used to be 4 of them, and now it's kind of dropped down to 2 of us, so needless to say, it keeps us busy. And then also we bid and schedule diverse fleets, so that includes regular, sort of traditional sources, thermal, natural gas, other hydro facilities, solar, wind, biomass. There's a lot of storage that is mandated, that all the utilities in California must have a certain amount of storage, so that's something that's starting to come around. And then I'm sort of the lead on process improvement for both the day-ahead team and the real-time team. So it's about a team of about 25 or so, or 30 of us, and I'm kind of the lead on making a lot of different tools to make things more advanced for us. So here, as mentioned, pumped hydro is kind of one of the huge topics in California, especially because we have way too much solar. We don't know what to do with it. So pumped hydro, so we can pump it during when prices are negative, and essentially we get paid to pump. And basically that's just taking power off of the grid and using it to run it through a turbine to pump water uphill. And this is the facility that I actually schedule. It's Helms. It's located 1,000 feet in the middle of a mountain, and it's between two massive reservoirs. And I pretty much get to price it how I think we should price it to make the most money off of both generating and pumping. And here's a quick diagram of it. We got two reservoirs at the top, corporate right with Sean, and then the generator labeled by D in the middle there. Like I said, it's in the middle of a mountain, 1,000 feet, pretty much from any other entrance. So that's kind of what my primary duties are. And this is just kind of a brief sort of overview of everything that we do in short-term electric supply, STES, when I'm a part of. So there's the two markets, the day-ahead real-time, and every morning we come in and we set up a price and load forecasting. So that kind of helps us get a good idea based upon past trends of where we think prices are going to go and where load is going to go based upon temperature and the time of year. We also optimize our whole fleet of different resources, mine namely being hydro, but we do fossil and solar and wind as well. And then we schedule all of those into the CAISO market, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. Then it hops over to the real-time team, which is, they sit right next to us. They're a 24/7 operation, meaning that somebody is there 24/7 all the time. There's actually two individuals, one that works the back, which is sort of our renewables desk, and one that works the front, which is the generation desk. And they basically take all the information in that's coming from the CAISO on a 5, 15, and hourly basis and make those decisions on what to do to help grid stability and to make sure that we maintain frequency, which is 60 hertz here in the US. Some of the other things we do are long-term hydro optimization. We coordinate outages. We do an incredibly large amount of compliance. I can't even begin to start that. We also help our IT team manage our systems, as well as we serve as sort of subject matter experts to long-term planning, policy, and other sorts of procurements. So now I'll get into sort of the general overview of the CAISO and what that's all about. So this is actually a picture. This is one of the facilities. This is on one of the facilities that I manage. This is the after bay of our Balch power units, which is down near Fresno, if anybody knows California. And believe it or not, there was a truck actually at the bottom of that waterfall about 2 weeks ago. Not sure how it got there, but it caused lots of havoc. So, in the US, there are a number of different ISOs or RTOs. They're basically the exact same thing to serve as an independent third party for all these different merchants to be able to bid and purchase supply and demand. So they act as sort of the intermediary. They're not in it to make profit. They're in it to make sure that everything is equitable between the different parties. And there's 9 of these across North America. This includes a few that are in Canada up there. And you can see sort of the CAISO is on the bottom left there. And we don't have any other RTOs nearby. We don't have anything near us, which is why California, for better or for worse, is trying to sort of take over some of those empty states there, if you will, and sort of make a larger Western market. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. California ISO, also known as the CAISO or the CAISO, depending on how you want to say it. It's all the same. It's all synonymous. It was created in 1998, and that's during the energy crisis. So California had a big energy crisis where there was a lot of merchants, namely, I'm sure some people have heard of it, Enron. They were the sort of the poster child of that. They weren't doing things fairly, and it was causing a lot of problems, and a lot of the utilities in California either went bankrupt or came extremely close to bankruptcy. So the California ISO was created to make sure that everything is run evenly and is run with the customers in mind, if you will. So there's about 26,000 circuit miles, and that's actually growing because they're adding some extra transmission in the state, and it's about a 50,000 megawatt peak load demand. So that's the peak hour, which is usually around hour ending 18 or 17. So you can assume 16 or 1700 in the afternoon or in the evening when everybody gets home from work. That's generally when the massive demand peaks up there. Supports about 30 million people across the state, and it's about 80%. So you can see on the map on the left there, not all of California is run by the California ISO. There's a few parts that are still run by some other corporations, namely irrigation districts or other balancing authorities. There's about 28,000 transactions. I don't even know how many I do on a particular day, but it's a lot. It's more than I want to count. But basically, California ISO its duties is to balance the power within its territory. So any power that gets generated has to go somewhere. And so whether it stays within the state, whether it gets moved to some of these other colors that are over here, which are other balancing authorities, basically have to balance the supply and demand. Otherwise, the system's going to crash. So that's sort of the ultimate sort of mission of what they do. From a market standpoint, which is what I am a merchant. I actually have merchant after my name in my email because I am only allowed to know certain information. I'm a marketer, which means that I bid and schedule. So I'm sort of a purely financial type individual, and that has its limitations. But these are the trading hubs in California that we sort of base a lot of our decisions off of, and they're sort of broken up by different territories. So there's 3 investor-owned utilities, IOUs, in California. The northern one is Pacific Gas and Electric, which the NP15 is all of PG&E, but our territory also extends into ZP26 and into SP15. And down south, SDG&E is completely filled in SP15. SDG&E is located on the bottom left of the state. And then Los Angeles, which is Southern California Edison, is also located in SP15, just north of there. So they both operate generally in one trading hub, but PG&E operates in 3 because we're so big. So here's just a quick overview of some of the generation that we have. We got some combined cycles. So in the upper left over there is our gateway MSG. So MSG stands for multi-stage generation. We got some natural gas peaking units. So when power is needed quick, a lot of power is needed quick, you can throw on some of those peakers. We got our Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which is 2,000 megawatts of baseload generation, which is a pretty good chunk of our portfolio. And then we also have utility scale wind, and we don't own any wind, but we contract out a lot of it. Some coming from as far away as Idaho and Canada. So we ship a lot of that power in across various different lines to get it to PG&E's territory. This is an overview of the CAISO. So this is the entire California ISO, what sort of their generation mix looks like. And as Rudy mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of renewables that are coming on to the grid in California, especially because we have our own internal mandates of how much renewable power we should have. So by 2030, we're looking at about 50% or so renewables. And so far, we're doing pretty good. We're actually ahead of our targets there. So you can see we still got a sizable chunk of natural gas, about 60%. Then we got about 30% renewables, which is much higher than any other state. And then you can see the breakdown on the right there. About half of that's solar, about another third of it's wind, and then the other is broken up into some of the other smaller categories. That storage battery piece, that's only 0.4% there, that's gonna have to go up. It was mandated that number increase. Not sure what percentage it is. I know quantities in megawatts, but I don't know what percent that actually is. But as you can see, we got about 72,000 megawatts of installed capacity on the grid. That doesn't mean that they're all generating at the same time, because that would be impossible. We don't have enough demand for that, and some of it's only variable, like wind, solar. So you can see we've got a pretty diverse mix in California, whereas some of the other states, and especially like Pennsylvania, a lot of it comes from coal and natural gas, sort of the older legacy power plants. But out here we have a lot of sun, and it's sunny right now, so we are trying to make use of that. This graph here is affectionately known as the duck curve, and if you look at it, you can see it looks like a duck. If you kind of squint your eyes. On the left we have net load, and then and that's in megawatts, and on bottom we have the hour of the day. So what this is showing is sort of a March 31st for every year starting from 2012 going out to 2020. What does the net load look like? And net load is the system load minus all the behind the meter load, which is, for example, rooftop solar is something that would take off from the total load and bring it down to the net load. And what we're seeing is that the 2020 line, which you would think would happen in 2020, 3 years from now, is actually occurring now. And the problem with that is that it creates a potential for overgeneration, which means that there's too much generation on the system. There's not enough demand. The power can't go anywhere because the transmission lines are constrained. And the only way that we can possibly balance the system is to start shutting things off immediately. And we've actually seen a few events recently, and it's becoming more of a reality. Even though that was projected to happen in 2020, it already started happening in 2016, and definitely currently in 2017, and I'll show some graphs later about that. So here's the CAISO Markets, kind of just broken down. The day-ahead market, which is in my title, and what I primarily deal with is bidding and scheduling of resources for tomorrow. So we come in every morning and we set up our portfolio of what do we think we'll be able to do tomorrow. And it's sort of a weird concept. You're always thinking a day ahead, but it's where we can get ourselves set up of what we think will happen tomorrow, so that the ISO knows where their anticipated position will be, to know how to balance the supply and demand when it actually comes to real time. So we bid in energy as well as ancillary services, and I'll go over ancillary services a little bit later on. And we sort of create the foundation for the real time. So we'll send up a schedule for a particular resource that we think will happen. So for example, in hour 5, we'll generate 50 megawatts, and then hour 6, we'll generate 10, and so forth, for all these different resources. So that when real time comes, when the actual hour that we schedule for actually happens in real life, there's sort of a baseline of what we think is going to happen. I won't go into residual unit commitment. That's a whole different sort of animal in itself. But then after that comes the real-time market, which is real time, and it's happening right now. It happens. There's a market that runs every hour. There's a market that runs every 15 minutes, and then there's a market that runs every 5 minutes. And it's constantly going. It never stops. The only time that the market will ever stop is if there is like a blackout. So back in 2011 in San Diego, there was a blackout, and there was all this demand that just went nowhere. It just disappeared, and there's all this generation that was going on. So the market pretty much just crashed, and they stopped it. So that's the only time that they'll ever stop the market. So it's constantly going on, all the time, 365 days a year, including all the holidays, which we rotate through, and some of us do have to work holidays. So the day-ahead market. This is Diablo Canyon here. This is down near Morro Bay, California. I was actually there this past weekend. So the day-ahead process. So this is sort of what all the inputs are into the day-ahead market. So we will send all of our energy bids, our bid information, our outages, any parameters that we have for particular units of, hey, we can't go over a certain ramping rate from 0 to its maximum. And then what are our ancillary service provisions that we can provide? And again, I'll go over that a little bit later. But we send up all this stuff to the ISO, and what they'll do is they have a very large sort of supercomputer that they have that runs this network model, and what comes out of it comes out of our day-ahead schedules. And then it also comes out the ancillary service awards and any sort of residual unit commitment capacities. And this is a purely financially binding market. So what does that mean? That means that you are not required to generate. So just because you got an award of 50 megawatts on a particular resource doesn't mean that you have to generate that. It just means that you got a payment for it. And there's this whole complicated settlement process I could go through, but I'm not going to. But it basically it's purely financially binding, so you're not required to generate that amount. Although, in good faith, you should. So here's the market timeline. So I generally start my day about 7 o'clock in the morning, and then by 10, a firm 10 a.m. deadline, the day-ahead market closes. So that means we have to have everything in by 10 o'clock every single day of the week. And then what the ISO does is it takes all that information and it sort of runs through a quick market power mitigation. So that's if the ISO thinks that any of the generators are trying to exercise their sort of monopoly, if you will, and trying to bid higher than they actually should. So it runs through that to determine if any bids need to be dropped or increased. And then it runs the integrated forward market, so the IFM. So that's where all of our awards will come back from this run from the integrated forward market. It's where they will clear the supply and demand curve, so pretty much basic supply demand curve, as well as the AS requirements. And then afterwards, then it does the RUC, which I won't get into. And then the results published around 1300. And then we sort of do it all over again in the afternoon to get ready for the next day. So that's just kind of a general overview of how the ISO actually does their process. And here's sort of another breakdown so you can kind of see sort of how the days line up. So again, we about 6:37 start the bid creation and whatnot. The market closes at 10, results published at 1300. We submit everything back in again around 1500 or so. And then the actual day starts at midnight. So we get all this prep work done ahead of time so that when the day actually comes, in this case Tuesday, it's all set up for success. So here's just the basic supply demand curve. In energy, and there's a sizable portion of the portfolio that will be scheduled they'll be self-scheduled or price takers, and that's usually with supply. And those are resources that you know will have to run, and you really don't care what the price is because they have to run. So an example of that would be the Diablo power plant, the nuclear power plant. They can't ramp up and down their generation because it's too dangerous. So you basically just have to essentially take whatever price the market puts out at, because there's no flexibility in there. So after you add up all the self-scheduled demand and supply, then you get the clearing price, which will be the LMP, the locational marginal price, and that price gets distributed to all of the resources in the CAISO. So they will all have the exact same energy price. The only thing that'll differ between the different generators is location. So there's things such as congestion. So if a particular transmission line that comes to or from a generator is a lot less than a different one, the congestion piece will be higher, as well as losses, depending on how far it is from where they measure. There also could be a loss component. So there's 3 components of an LMP that actually that give you your final product. So while all the generators have the same energy component, because of the other 2 components, you could have prices that range from $100 a megawatt hour in one location to negative $150 in another. But they all have the same energy component. It's just the combination of the congestion and losses that can kind of create these differences in prices. So here's a sort of a hypothetical bid stack. I couldn't get a good representation of this, but basically you can see on the left where there's the nuclear and hydro, which I guess are those sort of light blue, purplish colors. They pretty much have like a $0 value because, again, nuclear has to run. In hydro, it's kind of hard to put a value on how much that is. You're not paying for the water. You're basically just using it. So the only costs you really incur are sort of the operational and maintenance. So that's why it has a fairly low bid price. And then as you start creeping up here, you can see that the different prices of the different generators start to increase. And it's sort of a function of how much their LCOE, or their least cost of energy, comes in. And this is sort of, it's a factor of what they bid. So solar is going to be less than for example, like a really expensive natural gas plant, because the maintenance is much higher. You have fuel costs as well as the actual cost of the facility. So you can see how the prices sort of just start to kind of creep up at the very end there. And the dollar per megawatt is on the left side there. So you kind of see it goes from 0, which, again, some of the renewables have a 0 because the sun is free. And then nuclear has a very low cost and hydro has a really low cost. So here's just a quick, very basic overview of an example of sort of how an energy bid looks. It gets very complicated from here, but this is sort of just a quick overview. Supply bids have to be monotonically increasing, which means that every bid segment has to have a price that keeps going up. So for example, in this example, you can start at $40 and you end at $55. You couldn't start at $55 and end at $44. That's not possible. So what it's basically saying is, as the dollar value of that clearing price from the previous slide of the supply and demand increases, I am willing to generate more because I'm getting paid more. And conversely, with demand, it's monotonically decreasing. So I'm willing to take most of my, I'm willing to take a sizable portion of our portfolio demand at a particular price, and then as the price decreases, I'll take more of that essentially. So it's kind of a very basic overview of how sort of the bid structures work, and then it just gets exponentially more complicated from there. But the ISO is using these bids to send economic signals to these generators on what they should generate. And again, that's in a day-ahead form, so they do it for the day-ahead market, then they also do it for all 3 of those real-time ones. So there's a lot of different prices that come into play here to create some of these dynamics in the CAISO. So here's sort of how energy and ancillary services work together. Ancillary services are services that are provided and procured by the ISO to help with reliability. So they're not necessarily going to be used, but they're reserving the capacity to be able to be used in case they need it. So energy is just energy. It's just, hey, I'll generate 50 megawatts. So that's just sort of a standard component there. Then we have regulation up and down. So that basically means my energy schedule is 50 But if I have 10 up and down, the ISO could pulse the unit up to 60 or down to 40 in that exact same hour, depending on what they need to kind of balance out their voltage on the system. Spinning and non-spinning are two other different products. Spinning means that you're already synchronized to the grid and you can immediately start providing power. And non-spin means that you can parallel to the grid within 10 minutes and then provide power. So peaking units are a good example of non-spin because they can turn on quick and they can connect to the grid quick. So this is kind of just sort of how you can, even though you could bid 80 megawatts of energy full with some of these other products that you're not necessarily going to be taking, you can kind of see how the dynamics of an actual market work. You can sort of hedge yourself saying, oh, they won't take this, and then I'll, go from there. So typical day-ahead merchant operations. These are sort of just a quick overview of some of the stuff that the group that I work in does. We do a lot of renewable bidding and optimization to try and match what we think the generation is tomorrow going to output based upon solar forecast, based upon weather, based upon outages. And then we have different curtailment rates. So one of the new things that's on the ISO system is the ability to curtail resources. And curtail means if the price is not right, they will decrease their generation. And it's surprisingly coming into play with solar. So for example, if a solar facility is outputting $100, but the price drops below the price that's bid, you could curtail that resource and actually they'll drop their generation to 50, which is kind of using a system of sort of smart inverters as well as load dumps. They can take this generation off the grid, which is nice. We also do imports and export scheduling. There's demand response as well as battery optimization that we're just starting to get into. So here's just sort of a quick on how power flows. So the ISO will put out a forecast, a system forecast. Companies will then go ahead and buy and sell power that's scheduled into the market. The day-ahead market will run. Then the power is actually generated. The ISO will fine-tune their models, and then they'll manage the generation, and then it ultimately goes to the consumers, either being either large industrial or households. So this is kind of just sort of a quick sort of overview of how it starts from a forecast. So the very start is when the ISO sets out their forecast, saying, hey, tomorrow we think the system forecast is going to be 26,000 megawatts of peak. And then companies start to go out there and start to competitively bid and schedule to make sure that is covered. And so there's the day ahead process, and that equates to the integrated forward market that I mentioned before. And then this is actually when the real-time market down here is when it does the fine tuning in that hourly 15-minute and 5-minute intervals. So up next is the real-time market. So these are the 15-minute and 5-minute markets. Some of the other RTOs and ISOs across the country don't have the granularity of a 5-minute market. They stop at the 15-minute or even the hourly. So it depends on the different RTO on how they want to operate these. But in California, we have a 15 and 5-minute. So here are all the inputs that go into the real-time market. So basically, it's everything from the day ahead. All the day ahead information that was settled at that 1300 published time, that all gets thrown into the market. And then everything else that gets thrown into there is updating of bids, updating of unit availabilities, outages, any sort of transmission limitations, that all gets thrown into the short-term optimization models that the ISO has to run the real-time market. And then out of that comes the dispatches, ancillary service awards, startup shutdowns. So that's mainly for the thermal units that have long startup times. For example, some of the coal plants, like in Pennsylvania, probably have multiple day startup times because of how big they are. And then it's all communicated through an internal system. It's kind of how everything sort of flows together. So here's a breakdown. 15-minute, also known as the FMM, runs every 15 minutes. The bids that are submitted for that are due 75 minutes before the actual operating period. So you can't bid up until the last second. You have to bid at least 75 minutes beforehand, and then wait to see what the results are, essentially. So that kind of creates a little bit of excitement when you see something come out of the market that you didn't expect. And again, as with the day ahead, the 15-minute is only financially binding, meaning you're not required to actually generate that amount. Then comes the 5-minute market, also known as the RTD. It runs every 5 minutes. It uses the exact same bids that are submitted at the FMM, the 15-minute market, and it produces 5-minute schedules. So this is every 5 minutes, potentially a generator could be moving up and down, depending on what its bid prices are and depending on what the market is doing. This is the only market that's physically binding, meaning that if you get an award of 50 megawatts, you are required by the CAISO to generate that 50 megawatts. Otherwise, you will get penalized for not doing that. So this is the only market that's actually physically binding. There's different dispatch types. Economic is purely based upon a bid. So if you submit a bid or submit a self-schedule, a price-taking self-schedule into the market, that's economic. A contingency is if there's a particular location on the system that may either need more supply or less supply. So that's a contingency dispatch. Exceptional dispatch is pretty much the same thing as contingency dispatch, but they can enact those up to days in advance. And then a manual dispatch is if things start going crazy. The ISO might call us and say, hey, start moving generation around because we lost load or we gained load or something like that. There's something wrong with the system. So those are the different types of dispatches within those two different markets there. So I figured I'd throw this in because it looks fairly complicated, and it actually is. But this is sort of how the 15-minute and the 5-minute markets coincide with the actual reality. So at the far left there, the T minus 75, so that's that 75-minute window before the actual generation period that you're locked in. So you have to have the bids submitted by 75 minutes before the hour of generating. Then from there, there's a bunch of different markets that get run. And as you approach the trade hour, which is shown as the new trade hour, every single one of those single arrows is a 5-minute market that's being run, and every single one of those double arrows is a 15-minute market that gets run. So you can see there's a lot of different markets that are constantly going on to settle these different bids and self-schedules, as well as to make sure that they're balancing the supply and demand within its entire service territory. So it's a lot of stuff that's going on, a lot of dynamics, and especially when there's a lot of solar going on, this gets really interesting to see how prices kind of go all over the place. And I'll show a graph of that in just a little bit here. So here is 3/28/16. So this is last year. These are the different trading hubs. So if you recall on the first graph of California where we had the NP15, the ZP26, and the SP15, there's different trading hubs. These are the different trading hubs and their LMPs. LMP is on the left side there, that's in dollars per megawatt, and on the bottom is hours of the day, of this particular day. And you can see, and as you can see, they're fairly consistent. There's really not that much difference from a day ahead perspective between these different trading hubs. And this, again, a trading hub is not an individual resource, it's sort of just an aggregation of different areas. So it's kind of like a New York Stock Exchange almost, but there's a bunch of different ones. Here is the same day in 2017. So if you see here, this is the bottom price is about $5 during the middle of the day when the solar peaks, and it gets up to about $40 or so in the evening peak, which is the highest. Same day a year later, you can see settling in the day ahead, it's settled at negative $12. And this is something that's new to us. Having day ahead prices, which is usually the most stable market, because it's only financially binding. There's nothing physical with it. It's usually a fairly stable market, and we expect to have prices positive. But we're seeing prices that are settling at negative, which means there's generators out on the system that are still willing to generate at negative amounts, which means they're losing money to generate. And as you can see, the peak, which is a very steep peak, it gets up to 70. So you can see the difference between the sort of double peak shape, which this is kind of what we expect here, a morning peak as people wake up and start going to work, and then the middle trough as this solar peaks, and then the evening peak as people get home. This is kind of what we expect, but this is what we're seeing now. It's a lot crazier. It's kind of hard to forecast and expect. So now going from the day ahead, which as I mentioned is only financially binding, going towards the real-time market, this is what can happen in real time. So this is the same day in the real-time market. So this is the 5-minute market that settles. You can see prices are all over the place. They don't necessarily follow the day ahead. This is the day ahead curve for the exact same day. And you see it doesn't follow along with it. Prices go negative for a lot longer, and prices don't have as much magnitude on the peaks. So this is basically saying is that there's way too much supply on the system, not enough demand, and no place to go. So this is one of the dynamics that's definitely new to 2016-17, and it's sort of what we sort of expect to see in going forward as sort of a new paradigm, if you will. ISO on August 8th, this is last year, set a new solar peak of 8,300 megawatts generated at 1217. They set a new record this past February of almost 8,800. Set another record at 9,000, and they set another record a little bit higher than that. There's actually another one that was even more recent. They're at about 9,200 megawatts of solar, which if you only have a high peak demanded for the day of 26,000 megawatts and 10,000 of that's coming from solar, there's really not that much extra room for other things to generate, which is a main source of all those sort of negative and depressed pricing that you saw in the previous slide there. So here's two days, the exact same resource, two different resources on the exact, or one day and then the next day. And you can see on these are solar resources that are located sort of in central California area. And you can see on the left was a cloudy day. And you see how the output, which is shown on the left in megawatts, is extremely variable. Like highly variable, because as a cloud goes over, the solar plant basically like shuts down, and then as the cloud clears, it goes back up. So this is a huge cause of some of those sort of pricing kind of jumps up and down. And as you see the next day, a clear day, it's perfect. It's a perfect bell curve as you would expect. The sun rises up, there's no clouds in the sky, and the sun falls down. So that's a very typical sort of hypothetical, if you will, solar curve that you expect to see. So 2 different days can make a huge dramatic difference, and we're constantly trying to forecast and anticipate these up and down movements of these resources to get a better idea of what we should generate, what we should bid, and what we should schedule. So here's the same wind resource, 2 different days. One day was windy, the other day was not. So again, output is on the left in megawatts. One day there was almost 0 wind during the middle of the day, and then the next there was almost 100 megawatts. And this is only one resource, but imagine if you multiply that by a few thousand. You can see kind of how much variability there is on a grid, especially when there's one balancing authority trying to balance all of this generation. And again, it adds to the craziness of the real-time markets there. So I'll sort of conclude with the future of the CAISO. So because of all these variabilities that I just sort of mentioned there, and all the solar that's coming on the grid and the batteries that have to come on, we don't really have enough demand from customers in the state of California to be able to use all of that power. So now what the ISO is doing is they're creating what's known as the EIM, or the Energy Imbalance Market. And basically what it's doing is only for the 5-minute portion, so this is only for that 5-minute real-time interval, they take over the balancing of the supply and demand for all of the regions that are shown on this chart here. The ones that are part of it, there's a few that are planned. So what that basically means is, for example, if California had, as a state, as sort of the CAISO balancing, if they have 1,000 megawatts of too much generation, they can send it out as far away as Idaho and Wyoming, or they can send it all the way up to Seattle, because these different entities have agreed to either take power, import it, or export it on that 5-minute basis to balance basically the entire West. So this is kind of where the ISO is sort of expanding its footprint slowly. It's not a full-time, both day-ahead and real-time balancing authority for these regions, but in that 5-minute where things really become dicey, this is where you can either sell off a bunch of generation or import a lot of generation depending on how these different states are reacting. So it's a new thing. It's only been around since about 2015 is when they started it. And as you can see, there's a bunch of different participants that are either active or thinking about becoming active in this. And it becomes a moneymaker for them as well, because if there's oversupply in California, you can guarantee that it has a negative price, which means that other states will more than happy take negative price generation, which means they're getting paid to take the generation. It's kind of a weird concept, but if you do the negative signs and the addition, it comes out positive for them. So that's kind of a general overview of how the grid itself is expanding and how it's reacting to these new sort of solar paradigms, if you will, and how they're kind of responding to make it a safer, more reliable, and an effective grid. And that's kind of a general overview that I had of the CAISO. I could go on for probably a solid week or more discussing all the stuff that I do, and heck, I could do even a day on hydro itself. But I want to know what questions you guys have. If there's clarifications. I'm all ears.
All right, Chris, thank you. Spellbinding talk. So many concepts that you introduced, and I'm sure there are a bunch of questions. So, Maria?
Yeah, question. Like when you say about that you have to export because there's oversupply, and part of the problem you also mentioned before was congestion. How would they get out of that power to the outer states if there's already congestion?
So I think, Maria, correct me if I'm wrong, it's how do you factor in supplies in the midst of congestion and how it is delivered to the load? Did I capture?
When they're saying that they would to break this energy imbalance that California would export to other states.
Right. I think it was the last part of your presentation, Chris, about this energy imbalance, excess supply in California. What is the motivation? I still heard negative prices. What's the motivation there?
Yeah, so the motivation is, and I don't know if you guys have talked about Germany, but like Germany has a very large solar infrastructure, and they have all this power and they don't know what to do with it, so it just ends up sort of trickling out into different networks in different countries around Germany. It's not making them very happy. So we kind of started to see something as well where there's these different states have different resource mixes. So for example, California is mostly, when it comes to renewables, it's mostly solar. When it comes to like Idaho and Wyoming, it's a lot of wind. When it comes to sort of the middle states like Nevada and Arizona, they still sort of have a lot of traditional sort of natural gas type fired resources. And then up in the Seattle area, they have a lot of hydro. Like the Columbia River is like the largest hydro system in the country. And so all these different states have different resource mixes. And basically the energy imbalance market combines all those resources into one balancing area. So before, Puget, for example, I'll use Puget Sound, which is in the upper left on the graph here, they would balance their own area. And if they had all of this hydro and they had a wet year, they don't know what to do with it. So they end up having grid issues, they end up having grid instabilities because they just have too much generation that has to run. So having this energy imbalance market, any of these individual states might be at a positive or a deficit on a particular resource, and some of these other states kind of makes up for that. So it combines all of these states into one large generation portfolio to be able to use their strengths and weaknesses to make this grid, sort of function a lot better.
Without having to encounter negative pricing?
So negative pricing is mainly a California thing because of the solar is actually, and I can't get into too much of it because it's a sort of a trade secret, but yeah, there's solar's price taking. So if the solution of the market is negative, it's still taking that negative price, which means that there's still the generation happening and it's still at that negative price, but it still has nowhere to go. So that's where some of these other states pick it up at a very favorable price and will take it off the California grid because of that. So negative pricing isn't the driver, it's just sort of a benefit that they see.
Okay. Jim, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Chris is the person to address this to, but you have a significant amount of solar production in California. And my question is, how do you maintain the grid within the voltage and frequency regulation requirements of C84 and still provide reliability? How do you account for that variability in energy?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work done in accurately or trying to accurately forecast these solar resources. So the ISO actually has a third-party vendor that does all of their solar and wind forecasting, and they use a lot of different meteorological data to say, at this particular site, this resource, in the middle of the day is going to put out 12 megawatts one day and then 1 megawatt the next, that type of thing. So they do a lot of forecasting. They're also doing updates to these forecasts every hour once the real-time market hits. So they're updating these solar forecasts to get a better idea of, hey, in an hour, we thought 100 megawatts is going to happen, but only 5 is, so then they can account for that. As well as there's a lot of resources, particularly hydro and some of the fossil units that are on that can back generation if more shows up than is needed. So there's flexible resources that are on the market that are able to back when solar shows up or able to ramp up if the solar doesn't show up. So there's enough variability in the other resources to be able to account for this, as well as I briefly mentioned, the curtailment. The ISO can actually force solar resources to decrease their generation. So that also helps with grid stability.
Good.
Therefore, the market for SGIP.
Say it again?
Therefore, the market for SGIP.
Yeah.
There was a question here.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is there any priority on which generators are cycled down based on anything other than what the bids will be, or are there, obviously if you turn off a coal plant, you cut down on smoke and greenhouse gas and everything else. If you turn off solar, you just turn off solar, as near as I can tell. Hydro is storable and so forth. So each of these different power generation technologies has different external costs, environmental costs and so forth. Is there any priority on which ones get shut down? And the second
Yeah,
one is-
so I can
The
briefly
second one
go
is
over
about
that.
demand. Oh, sorry.
Okay, why don't you ask the first question?
That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, so I can answer that one. So all the generators that participate in the CAISO have to submit what's known as a master file. And the master file provides all the generation characteristics of that resource, whether it be minimum on times, minimum down times, maximum starts per day, what the ramping rates are, what the startup and shutdown costs would be. And the ISO has all this information. You can't change it daily. You can only change it like monthly. So they have all this information, and that gets fed into this market. And with a combination of the bids as well as all these different hard-coded parameters, they're able to say, hey, we can or we can't shut down a resource because of certain limitations. Or we can because it's a solar resource and there's it's just purely bid in. So this master file pretty much dictates how they can flex it, how I guess limited flexibility some of these resources are, or how unlimited flexibility some of these resources are. So that's kind of how they do. As well as there's certain resources, and this is kind of going into some of the finer details, but there's certain resources what are known as must take, which means that the ISO just has to take them. They can only back them down if there's an overgeneration event. And solar is most solar is sort of a must take resource, as well as the nuclear is must take because you can't back that down. So that's just kind of a brief overview of how they do it. Most of it's master file based, and then comes bid based, and then becomes sort of locational based on how they back different things.
And my second question was, is there a demand market that can take advantage of scheduling for the cheap times at the belly of the duck curve and stuff like that? Does your system also encourage or draw on companies that could turn off and turn on depending on how plentiful the power?
Demand response market?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so there is a demand response market, but I don't think anybody is actually actively participating in it because it's not an easy thing to coordinate. We at PG&E have a few different programs, but we don't actually participate them. I don't know about the other sort of investor-owned utilities, SCE or SDG. I don't know what they do, but demand response is not. It's something that's still sort of new when it comes to the actual market side of things, of being able to sort of bid and schedule these. There's still out-of-market mechanisms that the utilities can use, like if it's a really hot day, they can still call on select customers out of market to ramp down their productions. So it's still sort of kind of in its infancy, if you will, when it comes to an actual bidding and scheduling manner.
Okay. Do we have any questions from online?
Nope.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Chris. Do you see any change to the market structure as we have, for example, going forward with more renewables?
Market structure as in?
As, for example, we talked about these 15-minute market, 5-minute market, and the real-time market. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not going to go any more granular than 5 minutes because when they implemented that, I wasn't here when they did that, but it was pretty intense for them. The only thing that I could see that they would do is that they might enable 15-minute bidding. So right now, you're only able to bid at an hourly product. So, for example, I can bid 10 megawatts, but I have to bid that for the entire hour. I can't bid that on any other granularity. So if you're able to bid it at like a 15-minute, you could say I'll bid 10 for the first 15 minutes, 15 for the next 15 minutes, and then back down to 10 for the last two. So I feel like that's probably something that's going to happen at some point, but I think that that's probably the only real big sort of market change that's going to happen. They have a bunch of different sort of external products that they are offering to try and make, have different capacity markets and resource adequacy markets to kind of smooth over some of these, to kind of penalize some of these generators for not doing what they actually say they're going to do. So I think combination of all that is pretty much where we're headed.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, we'll wrap it up here. Chris, what a comprehensive talk. A great round of applause for him.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks a lot,
Yeah,
Chris.
definitely.
Appreciate it much.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.
All right.